Hello, it's a pleasure to be here at CSRI 2021, if albeit even virtually. My name is Dave Ridpath. I'm an associate professor of sports business at Ohio University, and my partner for this study and the lead author on our Sociology of Sports Journal article is Dr. Chris Knester, PhD from The Ohio State University, and you might notice I put The Ohio University down just as a bit of a joke there. But we're going to talk about today is our study on public opinion regarding payment of college athletes, one of those topics that's continually out there considering the state of our college sports industry. So the exact title is Should College Athletes Be Allowed to Be Paid? A Study of Factors That Influence Public Opinion on Paying College Athletes. So the agenda for today, as you can see there, we'll talk about the study. We'll talk about the actual survey instrument that we used. Certainly discuss literature review and previous research, the conceptual framework, which was CRT, critical race theory, that we used, and discuss public opinion, why it is important, why public opinion may actually have the ultimate say on this issue. We'll look into the actual meat of the study itself, our hypotheses, the methods and analysis, and of course, finish up with findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So the purpose of the study is pretty clear, right? I mean, the ubiquitous question, should college athletes be paid a salary? I think if there's been one thing that's been debated more than this, I would be hard pressed to find it. The paying of college athletes gets discussed virtually every day in some forum. And so because it's so ubiquitous, the purpose of this study is we wanted to analyze public opinion about college athletes being allowed to be paid more than it costs them to go to school. I know there's sometimes a school of thought out there that, you know what, they can be paid, but they shouldn't be given a scholarship. We're just saying, should they be paid more above the scholarship, right? More than it costs them to go to school. What does the public actually think? Now, historically, the public largely opposes this, certainly in previous research, previous surveys, although that gap is closing a little bit. Historically, that largely has opposed it due to the the mythological aspects of college students are playing for the love of the game, and amateurism is pure and keeping money out of it. You can tell I'm being a little bit cynical, right? But on paper, it simply sounds like a good deal. Like many of you watching this, I'm a parent. I have one child who has graduated from college, one who is still in college, and I get that, paying college costs, whether my kids are footing the bill in a lot of ways through scholarships and other things. But it sounds good on paper to say a person can play a sport and get paid a substantial amount of money or be given a scholarship that covers a substantial amount of things in exchange for that. And to many, that seems like a fair exchange. And honestly, I don't think that's a bad opinion to have when you don't really know what's going on behind the curtain. But I think most of us who are watching this know there is more to this. So the survey instrument that we used for this study is the National Sports and Society Survey. And this was a landmark survey that really gave a lot of information. And in fact, Dr. Knester and I and other researchers are doing several projects, dozens of projects from this survey. I'm working on a couple as we speak, but focusing on things like the national anthem controversy, social justice, other racial issues, perhaps with college athletics and youth sports even. But the thing is we got really some good data in this survey because it covered so many things. A very detailed, multi-question survey of U.S. adults, very large sample that was conducted by the Center for Human Resource Research and the American Population Panel in conjunction with Ohio State University and the Sports and Society Initiative. Very diverse group, 21 to 65 age group, all across race, gender, and income level, and other common variables that we see for demographics. The N for this, after the data cleansing, incomplete surveys, things that all of you are familiar with, was 3,993. Okay, so looking at literature review and previous research, again, as I mentioned, typical public opinion, at least in most research, has largely opposed compensating college athletes beyond a scholarship. But the main predictors of public opinion or factors that influence public opinion from the research are these: sports fandom, racial ethnic identity, the recognition of racial discrimination, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, whatever it may be, a person's age, urbanicity, where they live, right? Rural or urban, that certainly has an influence. Traditionalism, again, really focusing on the traditional aspect of college sports and having a fear that people would not watch or like it as much if the athletes were compensated. And I think that there's lots of evidence that that's not the case, but we'll talk about that in the future later in the study. But of course, there's also other control variables to talk about. Certainly, in previous research, the construct of race and ethnicity emerged as a major factor. Some of the notable studies you see there below, written by many of the prominent researchers in this space with regards to race in sports. And that really led us to, when we had this data, and that's what's been great about the NSASS survey, is that we had lots of data, and then it really became, okay, how are we going to frame a theoretical framework and be able to analyze this data effectively? And we decided to use the critical race theory, which you can see there, the names are very common. Joe Cooper, obviously, and others who have worked, Eddie Camio, some really fantastic people who have used critical race theory in their research. And critical race theory is influential in not just addressing racial inequalities, say like in the judicial system, but also to understand the position of race in society. And it's instructive to understanding the history and the continuity of embedded racial and ethnic prejudice, including in sports and other parts of society. And that's why we're getting so much data with regards to race and ethnic issues and intertwined with sports from this survey, and certainly in this topic. So critical race theory itself is the recognition that whites have primary property rights, control, and hegemony in society. And these conditions are evident in the history and maintenance of amateurism. CRT encourages us to understand the logic, structures, practices, and opinions with regards to compensation of college athletes, and that those opinions are typically radicalized and social justice issues. And you see a big disparity typically between whites and blacks on how they feel about it. And again, those are some of the prominent studies, again, on this subject. Here's the 4 hypotheses for our study. Hypothesis 1, we believe that there will be substantial support for allowing college athletes to be paid. However, this is going to be influenced by adult sports involvement, right? So how connected is the adult in this survey to their own sports involvement? Meaning, do they have kids in sports? Do they play sports themselves? Hypothesis 2, that racial and ethnic identities will be predictive of support for allowing college athletes to be paid. I think the previous research really supports this, but we wanted to see if this study and this particular survey that this would be a factor. White identities will be negatively, and white black identities positively associated with support for allowing college athletes to be paid. And hypothesis 3, the recognition of racial ethnic discrimination, that this is potentially a civil rights issue, that this is a race issue, which a lot of the research up to this point has certainly identified. And then, of course, traditionalism is negatively associated with it, right? So older, less urban, conservative individuals are less supportive of allowing college athletes to be paid. So for the methods, we use regression analysis in order to estimate the opinions about allowing college athletes to be paid. And here's the variables. And I know I mentioned control variables. You see there at the bottom of gender, educational attainment. These are the other control variables that I didn't mention earlier. Marital status, household income, family structure, typical things that you see in a lot of research surveys. But the dependent variable is college athletes should be allowed to be paid as athletes more than it costs them to go to school. Now, here are the independent variables that we use, right? The racial ethnic identities, beliefs about racial ethnic discrimination, traditionalism, which includes age, ideology, feelings towards amateurism, those things, and then of course sports involvement. But that also includes fandom, right? Some fans may disagree, some fans may agree. So here are the findings of the study. All right, for hypothesis 1, we found mixed but substantial support for allowing college athletes to be paid. Here's how it kind of laid out, and I'll show you a graph here in a second. But 25% strongly agreed and 23% somewhat agreed. All right, where you had 25% that strongly disagreed. But I'll show you a graph here. But again, it also changes when weighted with different control variables, right? When weighted with some of those control variables I talked about on the last slide, more than 51% of U.S. adults favor direct payment to college athletes, whether it's strongly agree or somewhat agree. So here's the graph I was talking about, right? So you can see it's almost 25% that strongly disagree or somewhat disagree, but the percentages are much higher, right? For the 51%, when again, we're going to weight it with what? We'll weight it with age, we'll weight it with gender, weight it with others. But overall, when weighted with those control variables, it's up to 51%. Hypothesis 2, the findings are significantly different by race. Black respondents were 2.5 times more likely to support payment than whites. And hypothesis 3, that a recognition that there are racial inequities is associated with positive opinion towards paying college athletes, and then traditionalism, mainly towards amateurism, fandom, lionized that structure by typical white, urban, and even non-urban, higher income, higher educated, in many ways as significant in negative feelings towards responses towards college athlete pay. So conclusions. This study offers valuable new insights into the extent to which public opinions are aligned with the traditional NCAA defenses of their views of amateurism, right? That, you know, people won't watch if we pay college athletes, we don't have the money, those types of things. We think that rather than asking what the public, and this is again how some of the questions were structured in this survey, we think that rather than asking the public whether they should be paid or not, or opinions about the precise mechanisms of how this happens or amounts of payments, the question should focus on what is the basic economic right of the college athlete. Don't get lost in the weeds of all these other things. Those things can be figured out, but we believe, and we think this study shows, that when you weight it and state it, that this is a economic rights issue, a civil rights issue, take everything else out of the equation. Do you think they should be paid? And we did find support for that. Also, the various factors, changed the conclusions a little bit, but certainly the ones here, racial, ethnic identities, the other independent variables that I mentioned, all had effects on the percentages. But certainly overall, the evidence in this study at least showed that there was majority support by the public for allowing college athletes to be paid more than it costs them to go to school. And again, as mentioned before, but whiteness and a lack of recognition, sadly, we still have that, obviously, of racial, ethnic discrimination are significant predictors of believing the college athletes, should not be paid. So here's some recommendations. I think certainly this study and many other pieces of evidence challenge the myth of lack of interest, meaning that people would lose interest in college athletics if the athletes were paid. As I mentioned before, position the discussion first as a civil rights and economic issue. I always loved what Taylor Branch said many years ago, and some of you probably saw the movie Schooled at one point in time. But when he said to athletic directors at a NACDA convention and other administrators, he said, you first deal with the athlete's rights. Everything else is an adjustment. And that's really how I look at it. I've found those words to be very powerful. And, what's the right thing to do? What are the economic and civil rights of the athlete? And then you adjust. And, we've adjusted to bigger things in this world than the compensation of college athletes. There is an absolute racial aspect to this. Whether it's someone on one side saying that an African-American athlete should just be happy that they're getting into college because there was no other way they were getting into college, to the other side saying you should be paid because you economically have more value than the college scholarship. There needs to be a recognition that race has a huge direct connection to this. And then seek to extend this work, explore public opinions, broaden the survey, and really, educate and inform people to make better informed decisions. Because the NCAA public relations machine is very, very strong, as all of you know. But research that we can do can at least lay out both sides of the argument to say it's not so clear, right? On paper, it may sound very clear why not to pay college athletes. However, look at the research, look at the reasons why. And that's really where we should go with future research on this. So here is, you might be able to see it, this is the preprint of the Sociology of Sport Journal article, which is coming soon. There's the DOI link. You can click on that, and but I don't know exactly what issue it's going to come out in, but you can find it online already ahead of print, and it goes a little deeper into the NSASS survey, some of our findings. Of course, like any presentation, this is a brief overview, and certainly you can contact me directly if you have any questions, or Dr. Canester, and certainly would be happy to talk to you about this. Thank you for your attention. Happy to be here at CSRI, if only virtually, and look forward to seeing everybody soon in person as we get through this. So wear a mask and stay safe. Take care.